We are committed to creating a safe and supportive space for our guests and listeners, and to provide information and tools that will help our listeners understand, manage, and overcome trauma. We understand that the healing journey can bring up challenging emotions. Therefore, we want to warn our audience that certain episodes may contain discussions or stories that could be triggering for some individuals. The content of the podcast is for educational and informative purposes only, and we encourage you to practice self-care and discretion while listening, and to reach out to a trusted support system or professional if you feel overwhelmed and need help on your healing journey. Hello, and welcome back to Healing and Growing Hand in Hand podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Tickle, and our guest today is Tim Fletcher, and I'm really excited about having him on today. I've seen him before. I love what he teaches. I love what he does. And let me tell you just a little bit. He is a global speaker, counselor, and researcher regarding complex trauma. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll kind of get into it.
Sure. I kind of got into this field before it had the title of complex trauma or even trauma. I came out of a pastoral background, and then I burned myself out in that field and wasn't sure where to go with my life. So I had 7 really, really painful, hard years of major physical problems, emotional depression, anxiety issues. It was really 7 years from hell kind of thing that I went through. And as I was trying to get my health back and get stabilized, I ended up working on a lot of farms. I worked on cattle farms, horse farms, tree farms, and without realizing how therapeutic that was going to be for me. But then I was approached by a friend of mine who, I had been her pastor for several years, and she said she worked at the only treatment center in Canada that saw addiction as a symptom of deeper issues. And so for the addict, when they started using drugs, they didn't see it as a problem. They saw it as a solution to all their problems, all the pain and emptiness that they were feeling. And so they were the first treatment center that was really exploring addiction by, if we don't deal with the underlying issues, we're not going to really help the addict just by trying to control the symptoms.
Right.
So at first I told her I don't think I'm the right person for the job, and I just flatly refused it. Wasn't even on my radar, wasn't on my interest, and I didn't know if my health was going to be able to go back into that kind of dealing with other people's pain stuff.
Right.
But about 6 months later, she came back to me and said, Tim, I really think you're the guy. Would you at least come for the interview? So I went. They offered me the job, and I said, okay, I'll give it a 3-month probation. I'll try it. And first week of doing it, I think I just found my home. I think I found what I'm cut out for, what all my life experiences have been leading me, preparing me for. And I just fell in love with it. But at that point, we were just exploring kind of childhood pain without no terms for developmental trauma wasn't even on the table then. Complex trauma definitely wasn't a term. Even trauma, PTSD was just coming on the radar. But I really had the privilege of starting to just explore, think, teach, develop workshops, interact with clients, build more and more understanding. And so then developmental trauma disorder came along, then complex trauma. And I, with Gabor Mate in Canada, kind of had the privilege of really pioneering a lot of that understanding of stuff. And I was doing it within kind of the addiction field at that point. But then we started to make it available to the public and started having people from kind of all kinds of backgrounds and places in life begin to say, hey, I think I've got complex trauma. I don't have addiction, but I've got a lot of the other 60 characteristics. And so it just slowly grew from that. But I ended up kind of in this field, not because I was planning to, not because it was on my radar, but because I kind of got begged to get into the addictions field, and it led into this. And I'm just so grateful. It's been life-changing for me.
And I'm so glad too, because, we were talking before we started recording, and just for me, understanding, as I've learned to understand complex trauma and how it affects us and how we, behave in that, has been really freeing. Because I told you, as I was telling you, that I had so many behaviors because I was in survival mode and I didn't share them. I know people saw them, but I didn't talk about them because I was so horrified by them, but I didn't know how to change it. Right. So that's why I'm so excited about having you on here, is getting this information out there and giving people the hope that, we're not crazy, that there really is stuff going on. And more importantly, that we can be healed from this. And some of the things that I found on your website, which I found was really interesting. And you said, if we can heal complex trauma, we can heal the rest. And I get it, because the complex trauma is the root, and that's what causes all the behavior and the actions. And once we get to the root of it, then we take care of those behaviors and those actions, which is super encouraging. And then you gave some statistics which I found interesting. You said 90% parents of children in foster care have complex trauma. So that's the parents. We're not even talking about the children, right? So they've got complex trauma, which isn't helping the situation. And I knew this to be true too, over 90% that are incarcerated. That's amazing to me. And you were talking about addiction. 97% of the people addicted have some form of complex trauma. Over 90% of the homeless, 90% of domestic violence. And then there's other with mental health, excuse me, and eating disorders and self-harm, which is crazy. So I can see why you say, if we can heal the complex trauma, we can take care of the rest. It's awesome.
Yeah.
So another thing, and we talked about it, the ACE test, which is the Adverse Childhood Experience, which I've taken, and I've shared with you that I was a 7 out of 10, which is crazy. But you modified it, and I'll let you explain why. But you modified it to 60 questions, which goes much, much deeper, which I ended up scoring 49 out of 60. And this is before I started my healing. So as I was sharing with you, I was able to kind of go back to the mindset and where I was at. And then I took the tests and I answered those questions based on before I really started my healing. So that just kind of gives a baseline. But I'll let you explain more about the ACE test and then your modified version as well.
Yeah. So the ACE test, to me, the 10 questions have been a wonderful tool, and a very much, I think, what people that use it and have used it for a while are realizing is it's pretty much a starting tool. It's not a complete tool. It's a starting tool. And why they would say that, and why I would say it, is because it focuses more on big T trauma events. So your parents fought, they sexually abused you, there was violence in the home, there was addiction in the home, there was a parent going to jail. So it's very traumatic, painful events.
Mm-hmm.
It mentions neglect as a form of trauma, but it doesn't show the hundreds of nuanced ways that neglect happens. And so what happens for a lot of people is when they hear the word trauma, complex trauma, they still think only in terms of big T trauma.
Right.
So they go, I wasn't sexually abused, I wasn't beaten by my dad, my dad didn't go to jail, so I don't have trauma. And then you go, well, you were neglected. Well, everybody was neglected. It can't be that bad. And they start to rationalize it
Yep.
and try to normalize it without really stopping to look at, how did it affect me? How did it cause me to change how I coped in life? And so the purpose of the additional questions is really to all the nuances of neglect, so
Mm-hmm.
that people can realize, wow, I did experience that. I wonder how that affected me. So again, it's not to villainize the parents, because a lot of parents, there was neglect not intentionally.
Right.
It's because they didn't know better. It's their own problems, etc. It's really to help the person go, how did it affect the child to not have their emotional needs consistently met? And so that's the purpose of the questions. And what I want people to realize is, if you have big T abuse like trauma or little t neglect like trauma, the child is getting hurt or their needs aren't getting met. So they're in pain, basically, that they're trying to resolve. And so the brain's response to try to resolve the pain is to adapt.
Mm.
I will do something different to stop the pain or to try to get my needs met. So they start adapting, and it's really adapting to survive. And the brain develops adaptations that, if they work, they go, that was a good thing. That protected the child. That met the needs. So they might start wearing masks. They might start people pleasing. They might start being a bit of a control freak, a perfectionist, all of those things. And they go, wow, those adaptations are getting me validation. They're getting my needs met. People like me. These are good adaptations. And so you start kind of forms of behavior, ways of coping that are survival adaptations that all seem like it was really good. And in a sense it was, because it protected the child and helped them survive. The problem is it's not till 30, 40 years later that you go, these adaptations, I'm not sure they're so good anymore. I think maybe they're maladaptations. And that's to me, the tricky part of complex trauma is
Mm-hmm.
you don't see the consequences of those adaptations until 20, 30, 40 years later when you begin to realize they're maladaptations. But then you go, now what do I do about it? How
Yep.
can all of this maladaptation come out of just a little bit of neglect? Nah, it's got to be something else. And it's hard to connect the dots because it's 20, 30, 40 years later. But it's like, how could something small create such a painful result
Mm-hmm.
down the road? And to connect those dots is very, very significant for people to start to be able to do that. And that's really been my goal, is to help people connect those dots, put words to it, understand it, so that they begin to realize that neglect, though it might be called little t trauma, was not insignificant. It had a profound effect on me. At first it seemed like it was a good thing how I adapted, but now, man, it's messing up my relationships, it's messing up my kids, it's messing up my job, my health. Okay, I got to look at this, and I don't want to, but I gotta, because if I don't, I'm going to really lose everything.
That's true. And I can that is so true in my life too, because it wasn't until maybe in the last 10 years that I realized I was living in survival mode. And so much of my behavior came out of my childhood, and it worked at the time, and it got me through that moment. And it's so true. And my brain went, okay, well, that worked. Let's save that for later. And then in the
Exactly.
adult life, all of a sudden, because I can remember some of my behavior and looking at people, and they're looking at me like I'm crazy. And I'm like, I don't get why they're looking at me like that. I don't understand. I understand it now. And I've had to go through actually a lot of forgiveness within myself because of my behavior. But I also gave myself grace and understanding why I did that, because I went through it. Once I first realized I was doing that, there was a lot more shame, and there was a lot more,
Exactly.
right? It went deeper. It was like, oh, how could I do that? And it was just a beat myself up mode. Then I had to, once I realized, no, I was in survival mode. I did that because that's all I knew at the time. I know different now, so I can do different now, and I can make it
Exactly.
different, right? And then I just have to
Exactly.
forgive myself. And there are people that I've actually reached out to and apologized for my behavior, and so that's good. But it is so true that, and I guess it's kind of, you've got blinders on, right?
Yeah.
And you just don't
Yeah.
see it.
Yeah. So uh, I really appreciated when Dr. Bruce Perry, who's kind of one of the leading researchers around trauma in the brain in children, and he wrote a book called "What Happened to You,"
Mm-hmm.
and he wrote it with Oprah, or Oprah kind of got him to write it. But he took 40 years of research and really synthesized everything down. And basically, what he said is, what has happened is the child did all of those adaptations to survive,
Mm-hmm.
which were maladaptations. So they end up being terrible parents. Their kids get taken away from them. They end up domestic violence because they don't know how to have relationships. They end up on the streets because they don't know how to do life. So we go, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you?
Right.
And we look at this, all those symptoms, and judge them, condemn them, and then try to put a band-aid on them.
Mm-hmm.
You just need more money from the government in order to provide this program to help you get off the street. And he's saying, until we start saying what happened to that child that caused them to cope this way, we're only going to keep condemning those maladaptive things and putting band-aids on them, and that's not going to fix anything. Um, we've really got to have a compassionate approach to that small child, saying they're doing the best they had with the tools they had. They didn't know any better. They weren't sitting there going, I hope I end up homeless one day and I hope I end up with zero healthy relationships. No, they were trying to survive.
Mm-hmm.
So don't beat up the child for trying to survive. Try to understand where they're coming from, but then don't let them remain a victim. Say, you're an adult now. You can have different tools. You don't have to keep coping the same way. You can cope in better, healthier ways and have a good life. Now you're responsible for that change. So you didn't start the process, but you can end
Right.
the negative stuff.
Exactly. I mean, and it's true. And this kind of came to me, and over the last few years, is that children and people act out for a reason, right? Whether it could be as much as something as bad as some form of mental illness, or it could just be something happened in their life, and that's what we need to do with that is slow down and pay attention and have a conversation with that child and give that child a voice and an opportunity to share, because kids don't just wake up one morning and just they're bad kids, right?
Exactly.
And then the other part of this is, and I'm saying this because this was really aha moments for me, and I hope it is for the audience as well, is that I just lost what I was going to say. See, I shouldn't divert like that. Anyway, but kids act out. Maybe I'll go back to it. But kids act out for a reason. And that's what I was going to say. And we as adults do what we know, what we've been taught, right? And so when I was sitting there watching my own behavior and knew something was off and just didn't know what, it was what I knew. It was what I knew. It was what I knew how to do. And what I had to do is have the self-awareness to go, okay, wait a minute. I don't like the way people are responding to me, looking at me when I do this, or something off about it, and look into it and and be curious and not judgmental on ourselves.
Exactly. So if I can just back up a little bit, Lisa. So I said that the adaptations were primarily to avoid getting hurt again, but also because there's a lot of pain from not getting your needs met. And so it's really to focus on, to the child, I want my needs met. I need to attach to somebody. I need healthy validation. I need to be accepted. I need respect. So all of those emotional needs of acceptance and attachment and authenticity, those are powerful, important needs for a child to become healthy. And so the child is saying, without realizing, this is all pre-verbal, subconscious, the brain is going, how do I get these basic needs met? Because if I don't attach, I don't survive. I can't meet my needs on my own. I'm too little. I need to attach to somebody so they'll take care of me. And so there's that strong, they're really pulled to avoid pain, but to get these needs met. And one of them is to attach. I need to connect to somebody. But what's happening, which they don't realize, and this to me then starts to be kind of the fallout of complex trauma, is parts of them are getting damaged without them realizing it. So they're developing, well, the reason I'm being neglected or abused is shame. I'm not good enough. Something's wrong with me. I'm bad. So they're developing a core identity belief that's negative, and that sets them up for all kinds of problems. But then they're developing a belief system that every time they try to be authentic, they've been punished, they've been rejected, and so now to them, authenticity never leads to intimacy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the truth is, authenticity is the only path to true intimacy, but with safe people.
Right.
But they've only done it with unsafe people. So in their mind, the mathematical equation is authenticity equals rejection.
Yep.
So never be authentic. So they desire intimacy, but they're now afraid of the very thing necessary for true intimacy, which is authenticity. So their life now is built on lies that keep them kind of in a prison.
Mm-hmm.
To go back to what works to get you instant attention. So use your body, use sex, use whatever. That'll get you the feelings of intimacy. Without true intimacy, that'll have to be good enough. And so the child develops all kinds of things that seem to work because they give instant gratification, but they don't meet the deeper need, the true need. They meet a pseudo surfacey type of thing. Um, but then to get them 20, 30 years later to go, okay, I'm going to be authentic now, or I've just spent 50 years of not being authentic and afraid to be authentic and afraid that if anybody gets to know me, they're going to see what I think's the real me and then they're going to reject me. Well, that's a lot of fear to go through.
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot of walls that I've built to protect myself that I have to plow down now. And that's where people begin to realize this healing journey is going to be a journey where I walk with through fear after fear after fear,
Yeah.
roadblock after roadblock, lie after lie. And wow, it's going to take time. It's not going to just happen overnight.
Yeah. It's 30,
And
40
that's so
years
important.
of building this. And you pretty much described my life. That was exactly
Oh,
what I did. Pretty much. It's so funny. I mean, and I'm sure, unfortunately, it's probably very common. So it's not just my story, right? But that's exactly it. It was, you know, I also was told and believed that I wasn't liked and or loved.
exactly.
So I spent many years and there were attachments and I attached myself to people that weren't safe, that weren't healthy. But I wasn't safe and I wasn't healthy either. You
Exactly.
know, and it was I
Yeah.
I ended up outgrowing a lot of these people. But you're right, it's been a journey. I mean, I started my journey, my healing journey at 19. I'm now 61 and I just really started doing the deep healing over the last probably 10, 15 years.
Yeah.
But I think part of that too is because we're really learning, like you say, so much more about trauma and the depths of it. So why don't you tell us, why don't you describe complex trauma? And you've been
Okay.
talking about the big T and the little T, which I know what those are. But why don't you tell us a little more about that so we all are on the same page?
Yeah. So to me, trauma has become defined, sadly, by culture to be a very narrow definition, which is just something bad, horrific happening to you. And it's kind of put within the PTSD, war, car accident, rape, that kind of stuff. And all of that is very significant and that is trauma. But that's actually only a small percentage of trauma.
Hmm.
That's big T trauma, but that's become kind of the definition. Over 75% of Westerners, and I would say people in the world, have little t trauma, which is neglect trauma. And neglect trauma, to me, is fascinating because it's big T trauma is something bad happening to you. Little t trauma is something good that should have happened to you that didn't. And so it's you didn't
Mm.
get something you should have. Well, that's invisible trauma. Like nothing bad happened to me. Yeah, but something good didn't happen to you. And that's hard for people to get their head around
Yeah.
because how do you quantify that? How do you but that's neglect. That's a powerful form of trauma. And basically it's realizing that for most kids in the West, their physical needs are met well, but their emotional needs are not met well. And that's where the trauma takes place. And so it's really an emotional damage that happens from emotional needs not being met. And so it's when you think of a physical need that's not being met, so food or water, your body responds by hunger or thirst. It has a natural built-in mechanism that desires it. The same is true in the emotional world. So you long for friendship, you long to be accepted, you long to fit in, you long for validation. When that's not met and you cry about it, then you get punished, you
Hmm.
get told you're weak, you get told you're too sensitive. The child then can't resolve that need.
Yeah.
They could resolve the physical needs of hunger and thirst, but they can't resolve that emotional need, and nobody's meeting it for them. So then what do? Well, they adapt. They adapt. They try wearing masks. They try people pleasing. They try all those different things, but they're starting to believe something's wrong with me. I'm no good. So I have no value. So now I have to get value from somewhere else. And so now I'm going to try to get it through my body. I'm going to try to get it through my job. I'm trying to get it through money and whatever. They externalize their source of value because they don't feel they have any inherent value. they're trying to resolve all of that, but it's not working. And so the result is they start to have to shut down a whole bunch of things. So I can no longer trust people. I can no longer be authentic. I can no longer have true intimacy. I can no longer have hope that there's going to be anything out there for me because nothing's worked. And you're
Yeah.
building your life on lie after lie. And that's, to me, when you get to complex PTSD, it's PTSD is a one time event. That's simple trauma. Complex trauma is ongoing
Mm-hmm.
danger, ongoing having to cope in survival mode, ongoing living with fear and having to adapt. Whereas, so that those adaptations become your main ways of coping, it becomes your identity, it
Oh,
becomes
yeah.
who you are, though it's not the true you, it's a false you,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a survival you.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so that becomes all thousands and thousands of programs in your subconscious mind about, if you see this, respond this way, if you feel this, respond this way, if you have this emotion, do this. All of them are maladaptive ways of responding to sensations, and those become the programs that run your life.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't even know they're there because they're in your subconscious.
True.
And so now you get to adult life and you're acting in ways that everybody's kind of raising their eyebrows, but to you, you think you're normal. You think you don't see anything wrong with it because that's what you've done. And
Yeah.
you're not even aware that it's
Mm-hmm.
maladaptive until things start falling apart. And that's usually what it takes with complex trauma down the road. Is you got to get enough pain from the maladaptations to start to register that maybe these are maladaptations.
Right.
Maybe I need to look at some stuff, because up till then you can justify all of that, and you can put a positive spin on everything you do, and feel good about it until your kids turn against you, until all your relationships break down. So, complex trauma is any child that lives in an environment where they don't feel safe physically or emotionally. And that usually takes place in the home, but it can take place within the community. You can have somebody at school, at church, at the local Y that is not safe, and therefore you're in constant fear. It can be in the culture where there's racism, where there's war, um, but it's anything that causes you to have to be in this fight, flight, freeze or fawn response as your main ways of coping. And I think what a lot of people don't realize with neglect trauma is you don't sense that intense fight flight that you would get if somebody was beating you up. You go to more subtle forms of fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, um, to try to avoid painful emotions, to try to um, not have to live with kind of not liking yourself a whole lot.
Yeah.
And you don't even see those because they're so subtle,
Mm-hmm.
but they're changing you in unhealthy ways.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had mentioned too before we recorded that a friend of mine had mentioned that she didn't have childhood abuse. She just had two parents that were alcoholics. And, she said, but they were fun. They were fun. They didn't fight. They were fun. And it was just, and there's that's a clear example too of, no, you were neglected because even though your parents were fun, they couldn't meet your needs.
Yes. So if I can just give an example around that. So anybody that would look at my wife's family when she was growing up, often it was presented as an ideal family, a wonderful family, because in public, and they were always having fun, they were always laughing, they were always doing things together, and every night they played games as a family, they wrestled on the floor as a family. But what I've learned in being married to my wife is her dad was a narcissist.
Mm.
And so the kids never could be authentic. They only had to adapt to what mood dad wanted them to have. They always had to have fun. They could never be sad. They could never be angry. They could never
Mm.
question anything. They had to agree with everything he said. And so they attuned themselves to his emotional world and adapted to please him
Mm-hmm.
and fix his emotions. And they didn't even know what they were feeling. They
Mm-hmm.
just knew what dad was feeling. They didn't know what they thought about anything. They just knew what dad thought about anything. They never felt heard or listened to because they were only listening to what dad wanted. And dad was this strong narcissist leader who, let's just have fun, let's just have fun. But they never felt anybody cared about them,
Mm-hmm.
to actually listen to them, to hear them, to see them for who they really were. And so they all had to be extroverts. Introverts were, nope, nope, that's bad.
Yeah.
Those are losers. You got to have fun all the time or you're boring. So you can't be real. You can't have a deep conversation. So there's all these topics that became off limits because they're too serious. They're too painful. We got to be just happy all the time. And so when you begin to break it down, you go, that's a lot of trauma in there to what
Yeah.
appeared to be a wonderful home.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah, because no one had a voice.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
I can kind of identify with that because I actually was proud of this, that I could be a chameleon, that I could
Yes.
be who you want me to be. I could be who she wants me to be. And I actually had an identity crisis in 2016. I had no idea
Yep.
who I was or what I liked or what I didn't like. And my sweet husband said, well, let's find out. So we've been on that journey. But it's true,
Good.
as a child, because I remember thinking I have to be this way in order to be accepted, and I already had the
Exactly.
mindset that people didn't like me, so I had to work extra hard to be who I thought that they wanted me to be, so that they would finally accept me and liked me.
Exactly.
And that's
So
hard.
if I could, yeah. So to me, to help people see the chameleon coping style in a bigger context is really important. So the two initial ways of the brain to respond to danger is fight or flight. I'm going to get out of here or I'm going to defeat this danger by beating it. And so the brain secretes cortisol, which is gets the adrenaline gland going and gives you the boost of energy to fight or flight. So I'm going to fight harder or run faster. But to a little child, fight or flight doesn't work. They're too little to fight and they're too little to run away. So the brain goes to a third and it gets, okay, cortisol is not working. Let's introduce opioids and let's go to freeze. Let's start shutting down. And so there's really two things that happen with opioids. So number one, I can't find safety by fight or flight into an external world, which is what fight or flight is for, is you escape the danger, get back to a safe place, then the cortisol stops. But the child says, I can't escape to the external world. So opioids let me escape into an internal world. I am going to retreat into a fantasy world,
Yeah.
into a dissociative world,
Yep.
into being out of my body, into distractions, numbing,
Mm-hmm.
um, because that's the only safe place for me to retreat.
Mm-hmm.
But with that, there's a high probability I'm going to get hurt. So opioids then deaden pain. And so that freeze becomes a main coping mechanism for many children with complex trauma. Um, and then what they find when they get to adult life is they can do fight, flight, and freeze. They've mastered all three. But there's a fourth one, and that is to a child who has to freeze, and they're still a small child. Their dilemma is, but I still need my needs met by the people that are hurting and neglecting
Mm-hmm.
me. So, how do I get my needs met? Well, I go to fawn. I will be whatever they want me to be.
Mm-hmm.
I will please them. So I will be one thing to mom, one thing to my brother, one thing to my dad, one thing to
Yep.
grandma. But I will learn to adapt and be a chameleon so that I get my needs met. So what happens with that is I must now have a radar that is more attuned to what you want and what you think and what you feel than to who I am, what I want, what I feel. So
Yep.
I will lose myself in order to stay attuned to what you are and think and feel. And so you have to basically stop being who you are. You give up your authentic self, you lose yourself and become something else just to survive. And that's why for most people with complex trauma, one of the most common things I heard is I don't have a clue who I am.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I've spent my life fawning. I'm a pro at fawning. I'm great at acting like I agree with you, but inside I could hate you.
Yep. Yep. Oh, yeah.
But I can sure turn it on because that's what I had to do to survive. But deep, deep inside is still the belief that probably if people got to know the real me, they would still reject me.
Yep.
And so I want to get to know who I am, but I'm almost afraid to get to know who I am because I'm pretty sure it's probably not going to be very good. And
So
that's
true.
It's so important to realize that so much of the shame, that core identity that's negative, that's all built on lies that seem like the truth to the child. So to the child, it's, am I valuable? The answer to the child is not, am I valuable in general? It's, am I valuable to you? And if I'm not valuable to you, then I'm not valuable. And so if I'm not valuable to you, mom, because you don't have time for me, then I'm not valuable. So it's all based on, I determine my value. I determine who I think I am based on how you treat me, how you respond to me.
Mm-hmm.
You're the mirror that reflects to me my identity. And if you're not a good mirror, if you're reflecting lies to me, I'm believing in them. And so for you to tell me 30, 40, 50 years later that that was a lie and that I'm actually a very different identity, not sure I'm going to believe that.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
it's a big challenge.
It's a big challenge. And I had one guest talk about a statistic, which I found interesting, and you've hit on it a few times, is that, especially with sexual abuse, women who are abused, it's on average, I guess, between the ages of 13 and 17, and it takes them 4 decades before they even speak about it. And you were just referring to, like, and so there's 40 years of people suffering and all this building up, so that by the time they do start to get help, it is a big job to overcome all these lies, because it has become such a core of who we are.
Yeah. Yeah. And just, if I can just kind of add one piece around that. So there's kind of the national sexual abuse statistics. But what I found out when I moved into the world of addictions
Mm-hmm.
is that over 75% of women have been sexually abused. Over 50% of men have been sexually abused. It's just like the rate goes way up.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say it's probably even higher.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, when a child, and most of them was when they were quite small, and it went on for years. But what happens is that just introduces so much pain, so much false guilt, so much
Yeah.
I hate myself,
Yeah.
that as soon as they find drugs and alcohol, they go, whew, finally I found something that medicates this emptiness and pain, because nothing else was touching the depth of that pain. And then it gives me a sense of false confidence, I can socialize now. It does all those things for me. And this is the perfect solution. And that's why so many end up in addiction.
Oh my God. Yeah. It is really, coming on the other side of this, and I've come so far. And part of it is I was able to put, it sounds kind of crazy, but my whole timeline together of my life, because it seemed like there were a lot of missing pieces. And over the last few years, I've been able to put it together. And so I have a better understanding. I also have a better understanding of my parents, their complex trauma, right?
Yes.
And they had both of them. And understanding that it doesn't diminish what they did for me or did to me, but it helps me understand, and also takes away, okay, so it wasn't just me. They had stuff too, and this becomes generational. And so,
exactly.
And we're talking about behavior. So what are some of the other, like, we've got addiction, right? We've got the flight, fight, fawn, which I did the fawn. I totally did the fawn. I thought I was a fighter, but I was more of flight and fawn, because I couldn't deal with it. I would want to walk away. But what are some of the other behaviors that come out of complex trauma that are common, that people may not even realize, oh, that comes from my complex trauma?
Yeah. So if you look at fawning, to me, like you get people pleasing, have trouble with saying no to people,
Yes.
so trouble with boundaries. You have perfectionism sometimes. You have wearing masks as part of that. You have, if I'm going to get my needs met, I got to kind of
Manipulate.
use being nice to manipulate people. So manipulation is all part of that. So there's a bunch of different ways that that fawning shows itself, but it's really it's a survival skill to
Mm-hmm.
somebody severely traumatized. So part of what I was saying with the fawning is it's kind of the last resort method the brain develops for a child to survive. And so it's got all kinds of different avenues that are part of that. Um, but then to me, the key thing that comes out of the damage that comes out of complex trauma is the child concluding it's my fault. The
Right.
shame belief, the core identity that's I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable. That core identity is again all based on lies, but that then leads to all kinds of behaviors as well that um, the only way that I'm going to get respect and not get hurt and people not see what I'm really like is if I wear masks, if I control everything, if I don't trust anybody, if I have fake intimacy but never true intimacy. So you get all of those kind of behaviors. The next thing to me that comes out of complex trauma is a child's needs aren't being met. So they're not getting treated with love, nurture,
Mm-hmm.
acceptance. They're not allowed to be authentic. They're being judged for being themselves. They're being punished for being themselves. They're being punished for failure instead of taught from failure.
Right.
They're not being given tools, so they're left to fail. So they end up with a lot of anger that they should have.
Mm-hmm.
Anger because they were treated in ways that violated love. They were lied to, they were betrayed, they were let down, their needs weren't met. The people that should be loving them weren't.
Yes.
And and so that should result in anger, which says, hey, this isn't right. This shouldn't continue like this. This is doing damage. But usually then that anger was punished. And so they had to suppress it.
Yeah.
And so most kids with complex trauma have kind of this deep lava anger
Yes.
that's way down there, and every once in a while it comes out,
Yep.
um, but it's there all the time, and it can come out as far as they turn it on themselves and blame themselves and hurt themselves, beat themselves up constantly in their mind. So there's an anger issue. Then there's the trust issue, and that often involves anybody in authority is suspect. I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
have anything to do with anybody in authority. Um, then there's tons and tons of fear, and that
Yeah.
to me what comes out of complex trauma is instead of love being the guiding emotion in your life, fear becomes the
Mm-hmm.
guiding emotion in your life. And now I fear getting hurt. Yes, I fear failure because failure never resulted in learning. Failure always resulted in more pain, which was punishment
Mm-hmm.
on top of the failure. But now I fear change because change puts me into a new situation where I might not know what to do, which means I might fail. So I don't like change. Well, now I fear the unknown because if I am in the unknown, something bad might happen that I'm not expecting. And now I even fear success because in our home, when everything's are going smoothly, the other shoe is about to drop.
Yep.
So as soon as things are going smoothly, something bad's going to happen.
Yep.
So now I fear. So part of what happens for people in recovery is they start getting their life on track and good things are happening. And they go, oh, and then they
Mm-hmm.
sabotage it all because let's just get on to pain because at least I know what to do. So you now fear success um, and fear good stuff. So you just got fear happening. Then you fear intimacy, you fear conflict, you fear angry people because all of those have never turned out good for
Mm-hmm.
you. Conflict was always a win lose. It wasn't, let's resolve this together. It's
Right.
somebody's going to be a winner, somebody's going to be a loser. So I'm afraid of conflict. So now I'm going to make peace at any price, never rock the boat,
Mm-hmm.
sweep everything under the carpet, all of those things. So you've got just one type of thing after another that begins to come out of complex trauma as ways of trying to survive for that kid. Um, One of the things that I think is so important for people to understand is when shame is your core identity,
Mm-hmm.
it affects how you then approach relationships. So you can approach relationships from a point of, hey, I've learned how to meet all my needs well. So let's have a relationship not based on I need you, but on let's work together and build this life together. Relationship is now me still trying to get my needs met.
Yeah. Yeah.
But out of a place of shame, which says you can't get to know the real me. And I have to earn your love. So
Yes.
I'm going to sacrifice my needs and put your needs as the higher priority. So it sets up relationships where I make you superior and me inferior and I serve you, which is a very unhealthy way to go about relationships.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sets up a codependent relationship, which is doomed to fail because I can't trust you. I can't be open and honest with you. I don't stand up for myself. I don't communicate all my needs properly. And so you end up with setting up relationships basically to fail.
Mm-hmm.
And that's to me one of the massive things that comes out of complex trauma.
You know, you were touching on anger, and I I recognize, and I used to be proud of the fact that I could shred people with my tongue when I was really angry. I don't do that anymore, but I was really good at it. And I could go like that, right? I could go from we're completely calm to hitting the roof. What I saw in myself, and it really was enlightening, is how anger filled my body. So I had a
Yeah.
situation here at the house, and it was a situation where someone was working on in my office, and they were sanding stuff down, and they covered up all my equipment except my Peloton, my very expensive Peloton. And I walked in, and my black Peloton was now powder white completely. And I instantly got angry because that's very important to me. That's my big stress reliever. That's very important to me. And I remember feeling like it was like everything slowed down, and I felt the anger rise and fill every part of my body.
Yeah.
It was so bizarre. And I stopped for a minute and I felt it. And man, it was overwhelming because I just felt like every little part of me was filled with anger. And I took a deep breath, and because I was ready to go shred this person for doing this. And instead I put it into perspective, right?
Yes.
It wasn't
Yes.
done intentionally. He just wasn't thinking. It can be wiped down, and it's not, and so, but that anger took me to a place where if I didn't manage it, I would have shredded
Right.
the guy, and I would not be proud of that.
Right. So if I can just put that in a little different context
Yes.
and perspective for people. So you had what I would call a trigger.
Yes.
But what happens with a trigger is your response, which was 0 to 100 in a nanosecond, didn't suit the event.
Correct.
It was over the top. And so a trigger is something that is triggering something deep inside of you that is wounded and that's causing you to feel intense feelings and wanting to go down a certain pathway of how to respond in order to keep yourself safe, in order to try to get your needs met. But it doesn't suit today's events.
Correct.
And so,
Yeah.
so it's really an event today that's actually touching an old unhealed wound that's causing this reaction.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I try to teach clients is instead of getting all upset, oh, that was a very inappropriate response, blah, 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 and getting down on yourself, go, what is that wounded part of me trying to tell me what that's not healed yet?
Right.
And usually it's so if you look at anger in healthy anger, because there is such a thing, and that's what many from complex trauma don't realize, because to them all anger is bad
Right.
and was punished.
Right.
But there's actually a good type of anger, and it's anything that violates love. So if you're lied to, you should be angry.
Mm-hmm.
If you're betrayed, you should be angry. If you're cheated on, you should be angry. Because what that anger is saying is, this is violating love. And if it continues like this, it's going to destroy this relationship. It's going to hurt people. So anger identifies something's wrong, something's violating love, and it gives you motivation to say, we got to get this straightened out. We got to get this sorted and back to a healthy place, or it's going to do a lot of damage. But what happens in complex trauma for many children is they're getting lied to, they're getting betrayed, their needs aren't being met, they're getting angry, and they're getting punished for it.
Right.
And they're being made to feel that they're the problem, they're wrong. But what can happen now today is, as soon as somebody disrespects you, as soon as somebody lies to you, as soon as somebody doesn't hear you, so they're touching the wounds that child got.
Yep.
Everything just explodes. And so it's realizing, okay, this is really my brain responding to something from 50 years ago. And that part of the brain doesn't keep track of time. It doesn't have the ability to tell time. And so what I do with clients all the time is, when they're triggered like that, they go, okay, just stop for a minute. How old do you feel right now? And they'll often go, I feel like I'm 6. And I go, yeah, it's probably because that part of your brain has just been triggered. Okay, what was happening when you were 6? Can you remember that? And often they can. They go, yeah. And it's a similar event.
Right.
But it was something they couldn't resolve back then. It's something they didn't have the tools. It was something that an authority was kind of not responding to them well. And their only response was anger, because they couldn't speak about it. They couldn't resolve it.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's look at it now from a different perspective today, and see what's going on today, and see if you could respond differently and see it in a different way. But it's realizing that the event today caused that little wounded part of you to go, ouch. And it's not happy.
Oh yeah. And I know, and I figured out what it was. And it was, from my childhood, my brother, he's a lot older than me, and he was a big part of the problem. He would just come into my room and just help himself to my stuff, whether I wanted him to or not. And I would cry about it and be upset about it. And he would damage my stuff, and nobody would stop it. So, exactly. But it was, I'll tell you, it was very empowering going through that and slowing down and realizing, because, and I want the listeners to take this in, because you described exactly the trigger. It's your response doesn't line up with the situation at the time. And when you go from 0 to 100, I talk about a justified anger. When you see something being done to somebody that's, you have this anger that you want to justify, but something like that is just so over the top, and it is, and it's empowering to recognize it and go, okay, this is off over the top. Why? And to be curious again and not be judgmental.
Exactly. And usually it's because something deep inside of you is feeling something that violates love is happening here. I'm being disrespected. I'm not being heard. I'm not being taken seriously. I'm being lied to, whatever. And so it's okay. So there could be something in the present that you need to address, for sure. But what happens when you've had that as a child often, so you were lied to all the time or disrespected all the time, is that now today you sometimes read disrespect into things where there's no disrespect at all.
Yep.
And so now you're responding over the top when nobody's disrespected you, but you just read all of that in based on your unhealed wounds. And that's where people go, this lady's crazy.
Yes. Yeah. And it's, because it's almost like, and I describe it as, you put like these, you have these new glasses on with these new filters, and that's what you're seeing life through, and it's not accurate. And it's true. And I had a situation where I was triggered. We had a huge flood in the house, and I was triggered. I had to run to the store, and, it boiled down to my home, my sanctuary, right, was in turmoil and chaos. And I grew up in chaos, and I have worked really hard to make sure my home is calm and a sanctuary. Well, we had a huge flood. And so I remember I had to go to the store, I had to get things, and I was just in this very focused, very triggered mindset. And I've shared this story on the podcast before, and it's embarrassing.
but I was in the store and I had my cart and I was on a mission. I was going to go get this stuff. I was, and I was in such a like mindset that this poor woman in front of me stopped, turned around, looked at me and said, "Oh, let me get out of your way." And I was annoyed at first. My first reaction was like, "Yeah, get out of my way." And then I'm like, "Whoa." Whoa, that was the energy and what I was putting
Yes.
off. It's so much so that this woman in front of me could feel it, looked
Yes.
at me and got
So,
out of the way.
so can I just say a couple things to that?
Absolutely.
Because to me, it's just a fascinating example. So, what happens with triggers and complex trauma is that in adult life, as you're in your healing journey, you can be learning new ways of coping. And basically, you're in your cortex brain, your thinking, mature part of your brain, where you're making wise decisions that are healthy and loving. And that's when you're a wonderful person to be around. But when you get triggered, you
It's
go
ugly.
into your limbic brain, which is your child brain, your
Yep.
emotion brain, your survival brain, and it's like you're responding on all of the memories of how you should respond to that emotion as a child. And so it's almost like a different person comes out, and this person is super demanding of others. This person gives
Yep.
off an energy that's very angry. This person can be lashing out, unreasonable, irrational, but to them, they're very rational and reasonable. They're just trying to, but it's their limbic brain has taken over. And so, what I tell people all the time is 98% of the time, you can be in your cortex and be the most wonderful person in the world to be around. But when you're triggered and you're in your
Yes.
limbic brain, that 2% of the time, that's when all the damage happens.
Yep.
That's when you're unsafe. That's when people just keep me away from this
Yep.
person. And that's when all the regrets happen.
Yeah.
And
And the
so
cleanup.
part of recovery becomes, if I don't learn to manage those triggers when I get into my limbic brain, that's when I do my damage.
Yeah.
That's when I hurt my kids, my partner. And that's the hardest part of recovery, is managing that limbic brain when it's been triggered. The second thing I was going to say, which to me is, and I don't want to read too much into this, but for a child that grows up in chaos, so security and stability for a child is really gained through two things. They need a secure, safe environment,
Mm-hmm.
a stable environment, but they need secure attachment to mom and dad. That is actually the more important requirement, because I can deal with a bit of chaos and a bit of unrest in my world as long as I'm securely
Mm-hmm.
attached to mom and dad. Then I'm relaxed. Then I'm comfortable because they're going to keep me safe. So, what happens to a child who doesn't have secure attachment and has chaotic environment is, I must create a stable environment.
Yep.
And that's a good first step. But what they don't realize is that that's only part one of true security and stability. You still need secure attachment. And if you don't gain secure attachment, then your whole sense of security rests on the stability of your environment.
Yes.
And if it gets upset, then
Yep.
you've lost it all. And so it's helping them realize that, yes, that was an important step one. Gain that stable, secure, organized environment that's your refuge, but also gain secure attachment, because
That's
that's really the central piece.
that makes
Does that
so
make sense?
much sense. Yeah, you're explaining it. It's like it's so, it's such a relief after all these years that all the stuff that was going on in my head, it wasn't just me. Like I used to think that I
Exactly.
was the complete freak of the world. There's nobody else out there like this. And I couldn't share this stuff because then you'll think I'm crazy because I have no explanation as to why I'm thinking like this, right? So why do you think we feel shame? Why is that? Why do victims and survivors carry so much shame?
Yeah. So if I can just make an important distinction at
Yes.
first. So we're actually using shame in two different ways.
Okay.
Um, so we're giving it two definitions. So to me, the correct definition is that shame is primarily a belief that I'm not good enough. But we predominantly use it as an emotion.
Yes.
I feel shame. So it's important to realize that everybody that comes out of complex trauma has a belief, but most of them don't even realize they have that belief. It's a subconscious belief that I'm not good enough. And they might even try to compensate for it by being a sports star,
Yeah.
have a lot of money, great job. And they go, how can I have low self-image? Look, I love myself. I'm wonderful. But yet deep down, they're doing all of that stuff because deep down they believe they're not good enough. But they're totally in denial of or unaware of that true belief. So that's part one, is realizing that changing that belief is one of the most important but hardest parts of healing complex trauma, because it has been so hidden and it's pre-verbal, it's subconscious, all of those things. And often we've compensated for it and don't think we even have it.
True.
But the second piece to me is the emotion part. So a person who has that belief will at times, so if somebody was to, so if a person has that belief, then they put themselves out there by acting in a play and they blow it. Now they feel shame. So the shame feeling is because they actually first had the belief, but they don't even realize that. They think the shame came because I blew the play. Whereas if a healthy kid blew the play, yeah, they'd feel embarrassed a little bit, but they'd quickly get over it. Whereas a shame person who has that belief is like, see, everybody sees now what a loser I am. And that just takes that emotion to a very intense place of being down on myself. So the shame feeling usually always has a belief underneath that most people aren't aware of. But then beyond that, what happens with a lot of people with complex trauma is now when I ask for help, I feel shame because now I'm being a burden. If I stop and relax, I feel shame because I'm being lazy or selfish. So shame now has a false guilt sense that I'm doing something wrong here by actually doing something right because of how I was trained. So if I do healthy self-care and take a day off, you're so lazy, and you just have all these shame feelings. So you get shame popping up all the time, either based on a core belief that I'm not good enough or the teaching that you got about that's bad, that's selfish, that's lazy. And then another thing that comes out of that, so if you had a core belief that I'm not good enough and you tried to gain your sense of value by having the perfect body, and that got you validation, then you gain 10 pounds. Now you just feel shame all the time. Because why? It's not because you gain 10 pounds, it's because your sense of value is based on the wrong thing. Or you come out of all of that and all of your validation has come from being noticed by men, and you go to a party and there's somebody prettier than you there that's getting all the attention, then you feel shame all night. And it's, well, I need a face job, I need something in order to get me more attention. So shame now pops up every time the shame belief gets triggered. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense. That's the best explanation I've ever heard of shame. And it makes complete sense because on my healing journey, I don't carry hardly any shame anymore at all.
Exactly.
At all. And when it comes up, it's so rare that it does make me go, wait, what's going on here? It catches my attention. That makes so much sense that it is a belief. It's not an actual emotion, but the belief turns into an emotion.
Exactly.
And it makes sense because all those beliefs get put on us when we're young, whether they're put upon us or it's conclusions that we've come to because of the abuse. And then we carry it. And then God forbid, because I carried so much shame, and then God forbid I make a mistake.
Exactly.
God forbid. And I was definitely one, and I realized that I put a mask on because I tried to create an illusion of my life being the way I really wanted it to be, but behind the scenes, it was nothing. I was trying, but it was
Exactly.
nothing like what
Exactly.
it
If
presented.
I, this has just popped into my head, but I remember once in counseling a woman who had severe trauma in childhood. Um, and all of a sudden she wouldn't look me in the eyes. She was getting upset, and I asked her, "What's going on here?" And she said, "I can't stand that you're looking at me with compassion.
Oh,
That feels like pity, and it's bringing up all this shame that you're
wow.
pitying me." And it's like, whoa, okay, that's fascinating, because now somebody can't even look at you in a healthy, loving way
Mm-hmm.
without you feeling shame.
Hmm.
That they're seeing your soul, they're seeing how ugly you are, and they're feeling sorry for you. So that's really kind of, again, another way that that can work itself out. And the person can just get wrapped up in, I'm feeling shame, and it's because they're looking at me, and that has nothing to do with it. That's triggering this deep core belief that if anybody sees the real you, they're going to hate you, not have compassion for you.
Yeah.
And the fact they have compassion makes you feel shame.
Oh, God, it's such a vicious cycle. So, how do we heal from complex trauma? I mean, I know mine has been steps, right?
Yeah.
I've done a few modalities, and I know, I mean, it's probably true that we're on our healing journey until we take our last breath, right? But what I know for me that's been empowering is I've learned how to manage so much of it rather
Right.
than it managing and controlling me.
Yes. Yeah, and I think so. A couple of things I think important for people to understand. So typically, when it comes to trauma, we have to really break away from the Western physical model of healing, which is, if I break my thumb, if I've got an appendix that's bothering me, I go in, I have a surgery, I go through therapy, 12 weeks later, I'm better. Um, and
Yeah.
people come into trauma and they go, okay, I go through step 1, 2, 3, 12 weeks later, I'm fixed. And it's like, no, the physical healing model of the West does not work with trauma. What happens with healing trauma is it's years and years and years. It's relearning all of life, because you've got thousands of maladaptive programs in your
Mm-hmm.
subconscious brain that you had to have to survive, that are still operating, that you have to become aware of. So that's part one, is it's relearning life. It's deconstructing my old life
Yeah.
and figuring out what's healthy, what's not healthy, what's a good program, what's a bad program, what are bad tools, what are good tools, and then figuring out what a healthy life looks like. And that takes a lot of time. But then, secondly, so that first one is education awareness. And that's takes a lot of time, but it's somewhat enjoyable because there's a lot of joy in self-discovery. The
Yes.
second one is actually not so much fun, and that is learning to deal with these intense triggers.
Yeah.
So I got to learn to regulate my emotions. I got to learn to get out of my limbic brain back into my cortex. I got to get grounded. I got to learn ways to help my limbic brain heal. I got to learn ways to catch myself in the middle of that intense trigger in that nanosecond from 0 to 100, and go, okay, instead of picking up the old tools here and doing the old things to cope, let's pick up a new set. Well, how do you do that in a nanosecond? That takes a lot of work.
Mm-hmm.
That, especially when you got cortisol pumping in your brain when you're triggered, which turbocharges everything. That's like trying to stop a moving train. It's
Yep.
just, it's really difficult. And so that's another set of tools, and they're some of the most difficult. And that's where a lot of the current stuff around somatic
Yeah.
therapy, EMDR, and just grounding,
Breathing.
mindfulness stuff is so important
Mm-hmm.
as far as emotional regulation,
Mm-hmm.
learning how to regulate my emotions. Because what happens is, usually the first few times I'm triggered, I do pick up the old
Yeah.
tools. But if I can learn each time from that, the next time I might pick up 80% old tools, but I might pick up 20% new tools. I've learned, I've grown.
Mm-hmm.
And then each time I grow a bit more. And as I grow a bit more, the triggers become less intense.
Yes.
I get through them more quickly. They don't mess me up for days.
Mhm.
They might mess me up for an hour. And then they become more and more infrequent. Because I'm healing. I don't get triggered as much. And so it's just very gradually the triggers change. They're less frequent, less intense, and I get through them faster. But that is a challenging thing. And so the key piece to me for people to understand is this: the deepest wounds happen to that child from their most intimate relationships. So guess when you're going to get triggered? Your most intimate relationships,
So
and they are going to trigger your deepest wounds. And so they're going to be your most intense. And so they're going to be the hardest to heal and change. And so so the first part of growth was based on learning. The second part of growth is based on painful triggers. And I don't like that part of growth. I wish there was a bypass.
I know, it's hard.
But if I can learn from each one and not beat myself up and just over a period of years, I'm going to see huge changes in how I respond and how often the triggers happen. So
because I share another trigger that I had, and I know it was interesting because it was one like over a year ago, and I took it from the very beginning. I realized I was being triggered. I allowed my body to I allowed it to go through it. And I had a husband who was a very safe place that I could say the crazy stuff that was going on in my head. Because I'm telling you, that's the thing that I noticed about trigger. First of all, the physical part of it. You feel the physical, you feel it because you're calm, and then you're not. You're just over the top. And then the stuff that goes through your head.
Yes.
If you slow it down and you listen to it, then you're like, okay, this is crazy. Because I was saying the stuff that was in my head. I was saying to my husband, okay, and he was driving, right? And I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna say what's going on in my head. Please don't abandon me. And I just said, and he just smiled. He's such a patient man. And I said, well, clearly I'm being triggered. And I said, because I wanted to self-sabotage so bad at that moment. I was going to do something really stupid. And I said, okay, we're not doing that. We're going to do the thing that you suggested, which is the healthy thing. But it was interesting to really go through that from the very beginning to the end. And I use it as an example, but it was so empowering to walk through it actually.
Yes. So if I can just point out so it's really to me a third part of recovery for people, and that's co-regulator. So a child has zero ability coming into the world to regulate their own emotions. And so they need a co-regulator. They need to be able to attach to somebody who's regulated, that they can connect their nervous system to and learn how to regulate their emotions and have that person help them regulate their emotions. So what do moms do if a baby's crying? They pick them up, they hug them, they rock them, they pat them on the back, they rub them, they sing to them, they talk to them, they explain stuff. So they're regulating their emotions, meeting the child's needs, but attaching. So three key things that are going on. And so part of that regulating is parents are soothing the child. What happens to a child who doesn't have a person to regulate with? They have to self-soothe. And usually the ways they self-soothe are quite unhealthy. So they rock, they eat, they have sex, they drink, they do whatever they can. Then they get into adrenaline rushes and constant distractions and constant numbing out, trying to soothe all of these emotions because nobody's helped them regulate those emotions. And so what most people need in recovery is you can't do this alone initially. You need a co-regulator. You need somebody who is regulated, that when you're dysregulated, you can connect with and have them help you work through your emotions and regulate your emotions and learn how to do it in a healthy way. And it's so important for people. And a lot of people, I think, feel shame around that because it's like, here I am 60, learning what should have been learned at 2.
Yes.
I feel like I should have a dunce cap on, that I'm in this slow learning class. And it's almost embarrassing that I'm learning at 60 how to regulate my emotions. That's all right. That you didn't get that when you should have, but at least you're getting it now.
Right.
And so be thankful and learn. And it's not like you're going to need your husband to be that regulator forever.
Mm-mm.
They're always going to have a bit of a role there, but it's like you need it now so that you can learn how to do that in those trigger times.
He's kind of I call him my normal, because
Yeah,
he grew up, a much more normal life than I did. And so he obviously sees things way different. Because sometimes he'll say to me, he has said it to me a couple of times, I don't understand why, because we don't fight, but we'll have discussions sometimes. And sometimes I'll get upset and he'll be like, I don't understand why you got so upset. So he
exactly.
asks me, why
Exactly.
did you go to that? And then I'll explain it to him. And he's like, okay, I understand. And so I always call him my normal. And so I can bounce stuff off of him because I don't have a normal. My normal is very different and my normal is not healthy. He grew up with very
Exactly.
caring, supportive, loving parents and family. Mine's the opposite. So you're right. That's
Exactly.
been a huge help for me. But he has to be a safe place, and he is. And it took he's the first person truly that I trust.
Yeah. And the other piece to me with that is he's not responding to your outburst, your
Correct.
dysregulated state with criticism and judgment. He's responding with compassionate curiosity, saying, I don't understand what's happening here. And he's giving you permission to be curious yourself. He's giving you permission to not judge yourself, but to try to understand yourself,
Mm-hmm.
which you never got growing up. And
Mm-mm.
so it's wow, that's the thing I needed as a little child that I'm now getting, and it's leading to so much healing and growth.
It is. It's been really, I mean, since I've been with him, it's really been because he's always given me that permission. He's given me a safe space. He's given me, mind you, it doesn't mean that it doesn't cross my mind that he might go, "You're crazy," and
Yeah,
I'm like, "Are you sure you're still in it?" But it's that's been hugely helpful that I do have someone that's normal in my life that is also a safe place.
yes,
Because somebody who hasn't been through that, or experienced it has no idea. And I can
yeah,
remember an example was my ex-husband, the first time that he saw my brother act out, and it was he and my brother really went over the top and acted out in front of him. And I remember him looking at me just like amazed that it was really that bad. It was hard for him to believe that it could be that bad until he saw it himself.
yeah. And that's where I emphasize to people all the time is you can't heal trauma unless you're with safe people.
Yeah.
If you're still with unsafe people, whether that's your family or your partner, your brain's going to keep going back to survival
Yeah.
tools. It's not going to go to healthy tools. It's going to go to maladaptive tools. So you got to get to safe people that you can start to trust before you can be authentic, before you can start to use healthy tools
Yeah.
and have intimacy. And so it's so difficult because for so many people from complex trauma, they're still looking for their biological family to validate
True.
them, to meet their needs. And so they keep going back in their healing journey to try to get all of that stuff only to get hurt again
Yeah.
and again and again. And it's like you're keeping yourself from healing because you're not setting boundaries with these people that aren't safe. Well, they're my family. Yeah, but they're not safe. You have to create safety for yourself because they're not going to create it for you. So you got to create it for yourself through boundaries. And that's going to feel wrong,
Mm-hmm.
but it's actually so necessary if you're ever going to get very far in this recovery journey.
That is so true. Because I actually, when my brother turned on my son, when my son was about 8 and tried to pull something on him, that was it. That was it.
Yeah.
And he's no longer in my life. And I did for several years feel very guilty about cutting him off because it felt, well, he's your brother, he's family. How could you, and I had someone say to me, because we were talking about forgiveness, and I have forgiven him, but the person said, you can forgive them, but if they're still being abusive, you do not need to reconcile. And when they said that, it was so freeing for me. And it was at that point, I no longer felt guilty. And it's not, hey, I love him. I wish him the best. I would love to see him have a good life. He's just not welcome in mine. He's destructive
Yep.
still. And I'm totally okay with that. And
Yep.
you know, but a lot of people do carry that. Well, they're still family. They're my mom. They're my dad. They need me. And it's like, no, if they're still being abusive, they shouldn't be in your life.
Exactly. Exactly. And one of the things that happens from the belief of shame in families is my needs always need to come second.
Right.
Other people's needs always have to come ahead of mine. So my parents need me. Their needs matter more than my needs. And I go, no, your needs have to matter just as much as their needs. Because if your needs don't matter just as much, you're going to constantly go to allow sick people, unhealthy people to do stuff, and you're going to take it in a way that keeps you sick.
Mm-hmm.
And so you got to start standing up for yourself and your needs. And that leads to the next piece for many people is when your normal has been unhealthy, it feels right,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's unhealthy, because
Mm-hmm.
it's normal.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go to a new normal that's healthy, it actually feels wrong.
Yeah.
And so it's realizing that early part of recovery, there's kind of 3 months, 6 months, even a year, where I go through this transition to a new normal where it feels weird,
Mm-hmm.
it feels wrong, I can feel guilty, but I just have to tolerate that until the new normal is normal.
Yep.
And it's just a tough stage for a lot of people because getting healthy actually triggers all kinds of negative feelings.
It does. And you're going to lose people in your life too.
They're going to turn against you. They're not going to like your new boundaries. You're going to get opposition.
Yeah. So there's almost like a lonely time. I remember that, but I don't get lonely anymore. I have my time alone, but I'm not lonely anymore.
Exactly.
And so you do get to that point. And I do have, healthy people in my life. I don't have a huge group of people, but the people that I have are very important in my life and they're healthy.
Yeah. And that's really what we've understood in understanding trauma, children, the healing journey is I just need one safe person to connect to
Mm-hmm.
in order to start getting healthy. I don't need 100.
Correct.
I just need one.
Mm-hmm.
And when you realize that, it's like, okay, I can probably find one,
mm-hmm.
and that's good enough for now.
Right.
So there's hope in that, big hope.
Yeah. That I didn't even realize that I hadn't trusted. I mean, I didn't even trust myself. Right. I couldn't trust myself, and that's taken some time to learn that as well as trusting myself and being okay with making mistakes. Like I share stuff on my podcast that I would have never shared before. Sometimes these stories come out and in my head I'm going, I can't believe I'm sharing this. Nobody's ever heard this, not even in therapy. But I figure, you know what? If people can connect to that and go, oh my gosh, she thinks like that too. I'm not the only one. They can connect and all of a sudden they're not this. Because I know for me, I just felt so alone, so different than everybody else. And why am I here? It really, it's interesting. And I'm learning so much more. And I've learned so much from you. This has been so incredible. And even just hearing about shame, like the way you describe shame was just, it makes so much sense. Cause I'm like, the way you're describing shame, that it's a belief rather than emotion, even though it feels like an emotion. And I don't have that much shame anymore. So that lines up because I've never thought shame was a good thing.
Right. Exactly.
When I did my workshop, that was the thread of commonality was shame.
Yes.
And it always, frankly, pisses me off that we have to carry the shame when we didn't do anything wrong.
Exactly.
So that makes sense.
So if I can just wrap up and add one more piece about shame, just based on what you just said. So what happens with neglect and abuse is the child develops, it must be my fault, it must be good enough, but I feel rejected and abandoned, because these people aren't there for me. It's like they don't care for me. I feel all alone in the world. So you feel this very much abandoned, rejected feeling. What happens from that is, well, I must be so terrible. I hate myself. I'm going to abandon myself. So not only do I feel abandoned from others, now I'm going to abandon myself. So I don't want to listen to myself. I don't want to take care of my needs. I want to just be busy, distracted, so I don't have to feel, so I don't have to think, so I get validation. So there's a self-abandonment process that takes place with shame, because I ultimately don't like who I am. And so what a lot of people think when they come into recovery is, I need to connect to others and get rid of the abandonment through connection with others. And I go, the problem with that is, if you haven't first connected with yourself and stopped abandoning yourself, I can connect with you all day, but in your brain, you're still believing you're only connecting with me because you really don't know me. If you knew me, you wouldn't be connecting with me. So the first step is not the connection with others. The first step is to stop abandoning yourself, to start being there for your own needs, to start being there to build a relationship and friendship with yourself. Then you're capable of connection and friendship with others. That first step of not abandoning yourself is a lot harder than it sounds, but so important.
And that's true. And it wasn't that long ago. I was doing something and I made a mistake, and it was, again, self-awareness. I heard this voice.
Yes.
And I was like, and it was vicious. What it was, I don't remember what it was saying to me, but it was a vicious voice, and it said something really nasty to me. And I remember going, whoa, where did that come from? And it was my mom's voice.
Yeah.
It was, and I was, but it made me realize that it was there without me even bringing it up.
Exactly. So what we do is, if you look at shame, your true identity is at the core, but you've concluded that it's bad. So you basically go, I got to hide that from everybody, even from myself. So then I need to create a false identity, a pseudo persona, my mask, to get others to like me. But the problem, and then you usually have an ideal identity. If only I was like this, if only then I would be popular, everybody would like me, I'd be happy. But outside of all of that, there's always this internal critic. It doesn't matter what you do, it goes, you're an imposter, you're a fake, I know the real you. And it's usually your mom or dad's voice or a combination of it. But it doesn't matter what you do, shame will always find fault with who you are and what you do. So you can't win. You can't ever do enough to feel good about yourself, because the inner critic is always finding fault with something. So it becomes almost a prison that you can't get out of. And that inner critic plays such a key part in just keeping you in that shame place. And it takes one little mistake, failure, embarrassment, and then that, see, that proves
there you go,
you're that terrible person.
Yeah, it's and how many times has that critic been nailing me, and I wasn't even aware of it. It just becomes, it almost becomes your identity. It becomes who you think you are. And,
And often we think that critic, I need that critic because it keeps me on the straight and narrow.
Right.
It keeps me motivated to do better. No, it doesn't. No. It actually beats you down and causes you to give up and rebel and just say, screw it, and get so down on yourself. So, but we still justify that we need it somehow.
Right.
And it's really, no, you need self-compassion. You need to forgive yourself. You need to accept yourself. And that almost sounds soft. That sounds like I'm just giving in. But no, so it's doing the reverse of what we think we need, which is the critic, which is often what we really do need, which is that self-compassion.
Right. When I recognized that voice, I was like, oh, no, we're not having this. We're not having this. And I did not meditate, because I'm an overthinker. So, you got an overthinker, you're going to take something like that and run with it. And then my whole day is ruined. Right. Ugh,
Exactly.
yeah. This has been so good. I'm telling you, we probably could talk for another hour easily. It's fascinating because what I love is that you're describing and explaining what's going on with us. That this craziness, that this behavior and this stuff that we're doing, there's a reason for it. And you're explaining
Exactly.
it out to where I can distance that from me. I can distance my behavior from me. It's not my identity. And yet I can, there's tools that I can bring on that are going to help me with this. So it's not, I'm managing it rather than it's managing me.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
what do you want to leave our listeners with?
Um, well, there is hope,
Yeah.
but it's a lot of work,
Mm-hmm.
and it means going through some painful stuff. So it's not just a day at the spa. This is some surgery
Yeah.
without anesthetic.
Yeah.
um, and hard work. There's no magic fix. There's no shortcuts. You just got to do daily the hard work. That goes for years, but there's hope, and you start to see the benefits almost right away,
Mm-hmm.
and it makes it worth it. Um, and it breaks a generational aspect to this whole thing.
Yes.
You're not passing it on to your kids. Um, so I just want people to hear the message of hope, but I want it to be balanced with the amount of time and hard work that it takes. And also to emphasize, for most people, you can't do this alone initially.
Yeah.
You do need a guide, you do need support, you do need a group. And so we offer an online program that um, puts you in a group with a coach, with teaching and all of that, just to help you get started on this journey and be aware. And for most people, that's such an important part. And there's no shame in saying I need help. There's no
Mm-mm.
shame in saying I can't do this on my own. You don't have to be self-sufficient in this
No,
journey. So
no, no. So, how could our listeners reach out to you? Because I know your website has lots of great information. You do have workshops and courses that are phenomenal.
yeah, so our website, timfletcher.ca, our online program is called Lift. Um, and it's a 75 module program that there's different options in which ways you can take it, but it goes through kind of an introduction to trauma. Then we start digging into a whole week on shame, a whole week
Mm.
on anger, a whole week on emotions, a whole week on boundaries, just to get to those deeper core issues and then the key pieces of recovery. And so it's partly we begin by understanding how screwed up we are, but then it's we got to go to understand what healthy looks like
Hmm.
and the tools to get us there. And so we try to put a balance in the program between understanding how screwed up we are, but yet the healthy tools and how to get to healthy. Um, so it's just for people to realize that there are resources. A lot of programs focus primarily on just learning to emotionally regulate, which
Right.
is super important. But to me, if you don't go beyond that to actually start to heal the shame, to heal the
Hmm.
wounds, you'll be emotionally regulating for the rest of your life and not see any
Right.
improvement. You got to get to that deeper stuff. And that's the most painful stuff. But when that starts to heal, that's where you really see the true change, lasting change happen.
And I'll tell you from my own experience that I've worked through enough of my stuff that I can share my stories and they don't have an effect on me anymore. It's almost
Exactly.
like I'm telling
Exactly.
someone else's story. Now, mind you, someone else is telling their story, right? That's a little different. But my
Yes.
own. And why I'm saying that is that you're not going to remember stories and still go through all those emotions and feelings and be triggered. It's just going to be a story.
Yeah. Yeah. So what we try to blend in the recovery journey, that the lift program, is you can't heal with information alone. You also need connection with safe people.
Mm-hmm.
Those two things have to go together, and that's what we try to provide. And so if people realize that it's actually that connection with safe people that's the scariest part of
Yeah.
recovery,
Yeah.
but I have to be willing to go there if I'm really going to heal, that's where we see the greatest amount of healing.
Mm-hmm.
So we put people in groups of about 6 to 10, and so they develop relationships as they go through together. It's just beautiful to watch.
Yes.
The connection deepening, they open up,
Mm-hmm.
they start to go, I'm not alone, I'm not crazy. Others have gone through this too. They learn from each other, they support each other. There's a facilitator that's kind of watching over that. But that's where the deep healing really starts
Mm-hmm.
to happen.
I know, it's the connection with others. I felt in my healing is when I'm connecting with others is when it seems like my healing goes deeper. There's stuff I've done on my own, yes, but it seems like the deeper stuff is when I connect with others. And that's also what I witnessed in the workshop, the women's workshop that I was running, is that first night we watched them connect. And for some of them, they've never shared their story. And so it's scary. And yet you see them connect, and it's such a beautiful thing.
Exactly. Yep.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. This has been great. I
My
really
pleasure.
I appreciate it. I mean, once again, I've learned a ton, and I appreciate it. And I know our listeners are going to get a lot from this as well.
My pleasure. Great talking to you,
Yes.
Lisa.